Welcome to this round analysis of Blake JS versus Nueva RT at the 2020 Tournament of Champions Gold in the quarterfinal round. The topic in this round was resolved: the United States should remove nearly all of its military presence in the Arab states of the Persian Gulf. I'm Eli Glickman, and what I'm going to be doing is watching this round, showing you how I'm flowing it, and then going over after every speech, and including crossfires, what was done ineffectively, what was done effectively, and the lessons that can generally be learned from this particular round. Let's begin. Oh, Blake is on the affirmative, speaking first. Once again, the resolution is resolved. The United States should remove nearly all of its military presence from the Arab states of the Persian Gulf.
All right, we can start. Jack, can you just put this by me? All right. We affirm contention 1 is drones. Whitlock 14 explains that the U.S. military is relying on bases in the Persian Gulf to carry out airstrikes in Iraq. Additionally, Tursk 11 contextualizes the Al Udeid air base in Qatar is critical to the drone wars in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The U.S. has given up on attempts to be precise with drone strikes. Boyle 2013. The standards of proportionality have been eroded with drone warfare as the U.S. has engaged in attacks that kill more civilians than combatants. The deliberate targeting of civilian events are neither proportionate nor justifiable and would constitute war crimes. 2 impacts. The first is civilian deaths. Ryan 18 quantifies the U.S. and allied strikes against the Islamic State killed as many as 6,000 civilians in 2017 alone. In fact, structural factors mean that deaths are much higher than figures say. As Boyle 13 explains, government officials assert without evidence that those killed were militants. The tallies of civilian deaths are thus much higher. Second is state collapse. Drone attacks systematically undermine governments and increase the probability of state failure. Boyle 13 writes that drone attacks weaken governments, undermine their legitimacy, and add to the ranks of their enemies. The popular perception is that a government is powerless to stop drone attacks on its territory will embolden its domestic rivals to challenge it through violence. State failure spills over and creates massive conflict. Fear in 15 explains that state collapse and failure raise the risk of civil wars and state failures in the region that are important for stability. Refugees strain neighboring states' economies and political balances. Regional conflict over failed states increases militarization, support for insurgents, and risks of regional interstate military conflicts. Contention 2 is Yemen. Hasbin 19 explains that benefiting from the U.S. security umbrella anchored by its bases around the Gulf, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have attempted to organize the region through military interventions. They launched, with U.S. support, an ineffective war against the Houthi rebels in Yemen. After America withdraws troops from the Gulf, Saudi Arabia no longer has the security umbrella that enables adventurism into Yemen. This will cause them to turn to a negotiated solution to the conflict as current conditions are ripe for an agreement. Hanley of March 2020 explains that the war has been costly both in financial terms and in the international reputation of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis would likely agree to having the Houthis share in power with the Saudi-supported Hadi government. This is true empirically. Parsi 2020 explains that recognizing that the U.S. military was no longer at their disposal, Saudi Arabia began exercising its diplomatic options. They stepped up direct talks with the Houthi rebels, and the level of violence declined as a result, resulting in an 80% reduction in Saudi-led airstrikes. A power-sharing agreement is critical. Wiesman 18 explains that the fighting in the blockade in particular has disrupted imports of food, fuel, and medical supplies, which is why Landry in 2019 concludes the UN has described Yemen as the world's worst humanitarian emergency with 10 million people on the brink of famine. Contention 3 is a U.S.-Iran war. Aggressive foreign policy has put America and Iran on a collision course. Coronavirus is making the war in the Middle East even more likely. Germanos from April explains that Donald Trump threatened to attack Iran and make the country pay a heavy price. With global pandemics and economic collapse, Trump wants to add a major war into the mix. KN 2020 continues that some in the administration seek to use the COVID-19 crisis to capitalize on Iran's increased vulnerability. Withdrawing troops from Iran's backyard reduces the probability of U.S.-Iran war for 2 reasons. First is provoking Iran. Continued military presence risks miscalculation and provocation of Iran. Abado in 2020 explains that U.S. fears of an imminent large-scale attack on its soldiers in Iraq is entirely valid. Iran seems ready to do whatever it takes to drive American troops out of the country immediately. The escalation by U.S. troops and the Iran-backed militias is putting Iraq at risk of an all-out military conflict. This trims down the possible scenarios for the U.S. future in Iraq to only 2: all-out war or a departure sooner rather than later. Absent a U.S. threat of invasion, Iran will cease its escalatory actions. As Torino in 2013 explains, while Iran has supported the Islamic Revolution, these actions do not create a network of offensive capabilities to become a hegemon. Instead, the focus of the new regime is survival, not expansion. Second is a shift to diplomacy. America's approach to Iran has become overwhelmingly informed by aggression, as Jones 11 confirms terms, the challenge has been treated almost entirely through the lens of militarism. Withdrawing troops sends a signal that the U.S. will shift to diplomacy. Arb-19 explained that peaceful coexistence requires the will to talk and compromise, and a U.S.-Iran war would be devastating. As Chusodowski in 2018 finds that a nuclear holocaust over the large part of the Middle East and Central Asia involving millions of civilian casualties will happen, and even if nuclear weapons are not used, bombing of nuclear facilities will release nuclear fallout, killing millions. Thus we affirm.
Can you send the impact evidence?
So let's talk about that speech. For one thing, this is the quarterfinals of the Tournament of Champions. It's very clear sort of from the get-go that this case was built for a more technically advanced judge. Morgan read at a speed, that would probably not be conducive for a super lay judge, and that he covers a bunch of really different arguments with sort of their own independent links. So essentially, though, the central narrative is the following. The central narrative is that the U.S. presence in general is one that provokes rather than prevents aggression, and one that, through a variety of ways is going to cause some form of chaos, whether it's interstate conflict or intrastate conflict, or in the Middle East. Okay, so the case is largely predicated on uniqueness, right? They're the affirmative. They're saying we should do something. So they paint a picture of the status quo as negative, right? In their first contention, they're saying that drone strikes are overwhelmingly bad. They're killing civilians. They're not very successful and not very accurate. The second contention shows that Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have organized a military coalition in the region, and that they're using that to engage in sort of military adventurism with other countries, particularly Yemen. And then the third contention paints the picture of sort of the Trump administration and how Donald Trump increased the probability of war with Iran through open threats, and that, that this moment is essentially unique in preventing war like that. That said, there are some ways in which the second contention and the second link of the third contention could be seen as interdependent, right? Both are saying that the existing US presence is militaristic, and both rely on an internal link of the presence forcing diplomacy to work. So in that sense, Nueva in rebuttal could say, we're just going to respond to the idea of diplomatic efficacy in general and save time. It's possible. So it seems pretty clear from the get-go that what Blake might try to do is to go for their first link on their third contention. This had pretty much the most work done. It was the longest. It had lots of cards sort of all leaning on each other. And it's spiking some arguments. The most obvious one that it's spiking, of course, is the mutually assured destruction argument, that Iran knows that the US and Israel are nuclear powers, that it would never aggress against the US because it fears obliteration by the US and Israel. They say that the military presence risks miscalculation, which is a spike to any mutually assured destruction argument, because if there's miscalculation, that overrides mutually assured destruction. It's also possible that they go for their second contention, because this Parsi evidence, which in my view is not great evidence for reasons that I'm not going to get into right now, is empirical warrant. It has warranting, and it is an empiric, right? So they can say that they have probability on their side. What strikes me as something that may be less strategic to go for is the first contention. It's kind of tenuous. We haven't seen state collapse because of drone strikes, so it's harder to go for this kind of probability weighing that is very popular and very winnable. All right, so now we're going to hear what Nueva has to say.
And then can I also see war in Yemen was caused with US?
No, I think it's already been sent, hasn't it?
Oh, did you send it? I don't think I got it.
Let's try to skip forward some more.
Nueva negates our sole contention is moderating Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a deep-rooted mistrust in Iran that inhibits peace from spreading through the Persian Gulf. This fear is rooted in Histus Marcus 19 of BBC warns that after the 79 Iranian revolution, Saudi Arabia perceived that Iran was exporting a revolutionary model of Islam that could inspire a revolution within Saudi Arabia, challenging the royal family's hold on power. When threatened, Saudi Arabia acts out on its insecurity, fighting deadly rebels and militias throughout the region in a series of proxy wars, drawing in outside actors like Iran from around the region. Withdrawing our military presence will reinforce Saudi uncertainty and cause proxy conflict in two ways. First, by magnifying internal uncertainty. Luck 18 of the CSM explains that the U.S.'s military support is the bedrock of the royal family security and stability. However, if domestic dissenters see the U.S. security relationship disintegrating, the Saudis grow skeptical of existing leadership, potentially challenging Prince Salman's hold to power. In response to the political failure of American withdrawal, the Saudis will have no choice but to act aggressively to seem strong in front of a domestic and regional audience. Lynch 16 of Carnegie Endowment explains that when domestic audiences question the regime's policies and policy failures, the Saudis seek to distract regional domestic audiences with aggressive foreign policy to enhance the perception of strength during a tumultuous time. This lash out will take the form of proxy conflict. Lynch continues that it is well documented that Saudi Arabia views the ethnic proxy conflicts around the region as a strategic battleground to build domestic support and often mobilizes sectarian tension to quell domestic uncertainty. Second, by magnifying external uncertainty. Hunsaker 16 of the University of London finds that forward deployed U.S. troops are one of the most effective ways to demonstrate security commitment because they intertwine American lives with allied interests, ensuring the U.S. will not retreat and abandon our allies. The loss of the security commitment would push our allies towards aggression, as Brands 18 of Bloomberg concludes that if the U.S. retreats from the Middle East, it would leave behind a more chaotic environment in which our allies feel forced to defend for themselves, lashing out to check back against external uncertainty. Tusi 18 of Princeton University furthers that today, because Saudi leaders feel they are the last Arab country standing in the way of total Iranian regional dominance, they believe any compromises acquiescence by Iran's regional power. For these two reasons, U.S. military withdrawal has resulted in chaos in the Middle East. Brands 18 of Bloomberg adds empirically that at every point where the U.S. has begun the process of gradually drawing down its military presence in the region, Saudi Arabia has surged forward aggressively, backing proxy groups and starting conflict to protect themselves as U.S. security assurance fades. Leads 03 of Rice University quantifies that having a security partner committed to a state's defense decreases the probability of conflict initiation by 28%. Overall, both links demonstrate military presence stabilizes Saudi security perceptions and prevents them from starting and interfering in proxy conflict. That's why Goldenberg 17 of Foreign Policy confirms historically that nearly every proxy war in the region, including Syria, Bahrain, and Yemen, were all started due to Saudi insecurity in response to a gradually diminishing U.S. military presence. These wars have been deadly, as the Red Cross in 2018 writes that due to proxy conflicts like Syria and Yemen, 15 million people are in need of aid and 19 million are displaced. Affirming now would collapse the region. Deep 18 at West Point finds that the very least the Gulf reaction to a U.S. withdrawal would be to fund Sunni proxy groups and fund like the fundamentalist militants in Syria and continue intervening in new conflicts like the unwieldy air campaign in Yemen. Supporting these militias is problematic, as Wood 12 of ASU finds that when third parties fund troops in proxy wars, casualties increase by 40% and the length of conflict increases by 2.5 times. Expansions of proxy conflicts are deadly, as Love at 18 of the CFR finds there are 5 potential conflict flashpoints across the Persian Gulf where Saudi Arabia would look to expand and cause new conflicts, including Qatar, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. Any escalation would be problematic, as Persian 16, as the New York Times quantifies that this regional escalation could kill up to 5 million through decades of proxy war and genocide.
Can I see a couple of cards? Actually, can I just see like?
Okay, 1 second. Let's get that back up and running. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so it's a lot to discuss here. So it's clear that Nueva is sort of going for a more unified narrative than Blake. They read one contention instead of 3. And so the narrative that they're going for is that the U.S. is a fundamentally reassuring presence to an otherwise erratic and aggressive Saudi Arabia. You know, whether it's the Saudi population that will become more belligerent when the deterrent effect of the U.S. is gone, or the Saudi government, which will try to distract from that through external acts of aggression when the U.S. is gone, because, you know, for one thing, you know, they're concerned that they're not secure when they don't have the U.S. So you could say that this case was made for maybe layer or flayer judges than Blake's case, definitely. It has a more clear-cut narrative. It's more easy to understand, and it's not quite as fast. And the general uniqueness that this is predicated on is that essentially the Middle East is sort of at an uneasy relative low of tensions right now, that there's this historical animosity between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that will boil over at any point when the US isn't there to curb Saudi Arabia's worst intentions. And essentially, so all of the arguments are somewhat interdependent because it's only one contention, which is to say that all of them sort of rely on the royal family seeing the US presence as essential to its security. For one, it makes the regime sure that there isn't going to be some sort of domestic problem that requires lashing out in proxy conflict, but it also ensures that Saudi Arabia doesn't need to aggress because they have this ironclad US security guarantee. And so, yeah, so this argument, Nueva has in reading arguments that are so interdependent and so similar sort of made it difficult to collapse, right? Because if Blake does this correctly, they can say that this first and second link have essentially the same internal link. So all they need to beat is this perception of security caused by US forces. And if they beat that, then the entire case is taken out. That said, it seems clear that the second link is better. It has more empirics, for one, with the Brands evidence and this 28% evidence, which I didn't get the name of. The warranting is just very good. There's lots and lots of it. There's empirics throughout. And you can say that, these empirics that have percentages, right, that have sort of a mathematical or a scientific element to them are actually spiking sort of more narrative arguments that will come from the kinds of authors that Blake is more likely to read advocating the position that they're advocating. So let's listen to Cross and hear what they have to say.
Last card you read, I didn't catch the. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah, sure. Okay, so you read me evidence in your second link that says that historically or like empirically, Saudi Arabia has increased support for proxies when they were like threatened with losing their security guarantee. So
Not threatened.
Or
it's when the security guarantee decreased,
so,
Saudi Arabia lashed out.
Got it. Yeah, I get your point. I was gonna say. So what specific proxy, like where did that happen? Like what specific?
Yemen, Syria, Iraq. Every proxy war on the status quo has been caused by military drawbacks. That's Goldenberg and Brands.
Wait, hold on.
So this is clearly shaping out to be sort of a debate between the Parsi evidence, again, which is kind of questionable for various reasons, and the Brands evidence, and the Goldenberg evidence, where you have, and Hal Brands is someone I recommend to all of my students because he's, in my view, a great scholar, particularly on lots of the foreign policy issues that debate covers. So Hal Brands is making a sort of wider claim than Parsi is. Parsi is solely talking about Yemen, but Hal Brands and Goldenberg are talking about sort of a broad history. So there may be a question later on of, okay, well, whose evidence has the better scope? Who's doing the better comparative?
Yemen?
Yes. Yemen was caused because they felt the U.S. was pulling away military assurance.
Why did the last time the U.S.
Your evidence that you read on your case about Yemen confirms this assertion?
No, the fact that the United States threatened
Saudi Arabia,
to pull
the
away.
evidence you sent me on the email chain says Saudi Arabia went in first, and then the U.S. followed them.
I don't know. Wait, I'm talking about the Parsi evidence that I read, right? The Parsi evidence that I read.
I don't care about Parsi. I'm talking about every proxy war in the region has been started as a decrease of U.S. military security guarantees. I have a question.
Well, I know. Then I have a follow-up then, right?
Can we talk about your first contention about drones?
Okay,
Do you think state collapse will happen? Where will state collapse happen?
Okay, so notice the tactic that Noah just used, where he asked for a question and then just started asking it. He, recognized that what Morgan was going to do is probably try to weasel in a couple more, which is, again, nothing, not to disrespect Morgan at all, that's a valid strategy, but he recognized that Morgan was trying to sneak in a few more questions, and Noah wanted to change the debate, presumably because he would rather have this speech about comparing Goldenberg and Brands to Parsi, have that in speech rather than in cross.
Can I just clear this up first? 1 second.
So
So,
sure, yeah. Sorry, I thought you were done, so I apologize.
why did
Okay, so there you go, right? And that was sort of an effective thing on Morgan's part of seeming reasonable and trying to get in a word edgewise. Asking to clear this up is a pretty, relatable question, and it's one judges will often be sympathetic to.
the violence in Yemen decreased by 80% when the last time the United States threatened to withdraw?
So violence in Yemen did not decrease by 80%. There was a small blip in a decrease in airstrikes, but only lasted for 2 weeks. In March, Saudi Arabia started airstrikes again, which proves that all the diplomacy that you're talking about is probably short-term. Let's talk about your first intention about drones. State collapse. Which state collapses in the Middle East?
Right. So this is sort of what I was talking about before, where there is a lack of specificity. So Noah is going to try to get Morgan to give a specific example, which will make it easier for Nueva in their speeches to sort of presumably attack that example head on.
A good example are pretty much all the proxies that are going on right now, what we're using for.
But they're already failed states. New states collapse.
Failed states because of drones. We'd say new states. First of all, states are likely to collapse.
All the states in the status quo have collapsed already. So I'm asking, what new states are you worried about? Because if we're right, we decrease the chance of any conflict.
Pakistan, Afghanistan, Libya. Are
okay, so you're saying Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Libya are dependent on predator drone bases in the United States, not predator drone bases in Afghanistan.
Yes, our evidence specifically indicates.
Because your evidence is talking about predator drones carrying out strikes in Iraq. We have evidence saying that predator drones are based in Afghanistan, which is much closer to Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Second card says that the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar is where we launch all our drones to carry out drone strikes in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Can I ask a question?
Okay, that's fine.
Yes, you can read the card. I can send it to you. It's
I know. Okay, that's fine.
So let's talk about your diversionary war thing, right? So why does in order to get a domestic victory, why does he have to look outwards? Why can't MBS do more economic liberalization to appeal to their young population?
So it's not about the young population, it's about the Saudi royals. So there's the Saudi royal family, so it's 800 princes in it. The argument is that without the U.S. security guarantee, MBS is no longer legitimized. That's less.
Your evidence is not about the royal family. But second of all, my question still stands. He can do other things.
I think I answered it. It's not about the population.
Okay, so you can sort of see from the get-go what is going to be probably a unifying theme in this debate, right? You have two contested narratives. Each is saying quite literally the opposite thing. One is saying that the U.S. is good for stability. The other is saying the opposite, that the U.S. is bad for stability. So this is going to be a debate that comes down probably to who has the best evidence on these questions, and why their evidence is better. So,
All
right, so it's just gonna probably flow the wang on their case. Is everyone ready? All right. Our first contention of state collapse outweighs theirs in two ways. We say drone strikes eventually cause these states to collapse. First, on a prerequisite, Boyd explains when states collapse, it causes spillover violence and the proliferation of violence in zones without governance means that proxy conflicts can flourish. Second, on reversibility, it takes more resources and political change to rebuild institutions of an entire collapsed state than it takes to negotiate a peace deal to a proxy conflict. Our second contention also outweighs on a risk of solvency. Lang 2020 describes the Yemen crisis as the worst humanitarian crisis in the world. On faces of low likelihood that any new conflict Saudi Arabia creates will be worse. You should focus on solving Yemen first. They just assert without any warrant or historical examples that the reason why Yemen happened is because the U.S. withdrew its troops, but that's the status quo, so that's a harm that they have to account for. Our third contention also outweighs for two reasons. First is on magnitude. Jezudowski 19 explains the US-Iran war scenario would cause a nuclear holocaust over half the Middle East and kills millions more than any proxy wars would. That's our evidence from the case. But then secondly, US-Iran war also turns proxy wars, and with the US involved, they expand outside the Middle East, meaning we also outweigh on scope, because War 2020 explains that ruthless proxy spreading chaos on multiple continents. The US-Iran war has the potential to be one of the worst conflicts in history. Let's prove both of their contentions with a few generalized responses. Firstly, the ceasefire in Yemen is failing now, even though preconditions for diplomacy are there, as Heap says in our case. The Karen explains that the Houthis have violated the ceasefire 240 times. TRT of April 16th explains that Houthi non-compliance stems from Saudi refusal to make concessions and accept Houthi demands. That's why making Saudi Arabia willing to negotiate is key to solving the problem. Secondly, turn the argument against them. The parsing empiric from our case about when Trump threatened to pull out proves that when Saudi Arabia is scared, they do diplomacy with regional actors like Iran and Israel, assuming America is out of the picture. They'll say that America started attacks again in March, but that was after we killed Soleimani, as Parsi says, and confirmed the Hawkish security guarantee, and the conflict then resumes. But for this overall, there are other empirics because it postdates them by 2 years and assumes Trump's unpredictable foreign policy. Third, turn the argument. Failure to respond to Saudi condemnation causes emboldenment. Hobby 18 explains that Trump stood by the crown prince even as U.S. military support came under attack. The administration emboldened people in Riyadh, giving it carte blanche to pursue more aggressive policies. Fourth, the Trump administration makes leverage fail. Burns 19 explains that Trump's wildcat-style diplomacy succeeded in undercutting the effectiveness of the State Department. Diplomatic efforts are undertaken by amateurs willing to give the president his way. But fifth, U.S. can't control these allies. Shapiro in 2015 explains that GCC interests and U.S. interests increasingly diverge over issues. American officials convince themselves that they need to change U.S. policy more than Persian Gulf partners need to change theirs. But then let's specifically talk about each one of their links. On the first link about collapsing the legitimacy of the Saudi Arabian government. First, note they give zero warrant or contextualization why the legitimacy in the royal family depends on U.S. ties. Don't vote for an argument that misses a clear contextualized internal warrant. But then secondly, I would say that is not true at all. There's a lot of anti-U.S. sentiment in the Middle East generally, and that includes Saudi Arabia. I would be sure that many of these people would prefer a self-sufficient Saudi Arabia as to one that is propped up by America. So it isn't true this loss of legitimacy just forces them to lash out 100%. But third, they forget that it is a monarchy. They don't have to lash out for anyone. They face no domestic pressure because they don't have elections, and clearly they don't care about international pressure because all sorts of sanctions, international condemnation didn't even affect how they operated in the Yemen conflict. So really, pressure doesn't at all get to anyone in the Saudi regime. On the second link about external uncertainty, again, the grouping answers both of these links. But let's answer a few of these specific claims that they make, beginning with the 2Z18 evidence about how basically Saudi Arabia views any diplomacy as acquiescence. Again, Parsi postdates. Parsi is from like 2 or 3 weeks ago. What they say is that after these states thought the Saudis were going to pull out, the Saudi Arabians literally sit down and did diplomacy with Iran and Israel. That literally proves that Saudi Arabia does not rule out diplomacy in any case. They literally are 100% comfortable with conducting it. But then on the Leeds evidence, they say that we decrease allied violence. That evidence is not specific to the U.S. and it's almost like 20 years old. Don't value this argument. But then they read evidence that says the gradually diminishing U.S. presence is the reason why these proxy wars were started. First, just an assertion. There is no warrant in the card for why this is true. But then secondly, again, that's the status quo. If our military presence is there and violence is getting worse, that proves we should take a different strategy based off of pulling out.
All right, we're gonna take preps.
Okay.
Sorry, no.
So let's talk about that rebuttal. Sorry, this keeps happening with the tech. Okay, so let's take a look. So Jack starts off with some weighing. So like I said, it was Nueva's sort of fatal flaw in their case is that it's very easy to group. And that's what Blake did. Blake was able to weigh their contentions individually against this big omnibus contention that Nueva runs, and they were able to, drop or Jack was able to drop 5 top shelf responses on the entire case, most of which are offensive. No part of the speech was really inefficient. Jack did pretty well. There are some responses that he, maybe could have been a little more word efficient on, but it was generally a very good speech. So because the arguments are so easy, are so similar, Jack allocated time pretty efficiently, right? He only really needed to respond to one central theme. The one thing I think that was maybe less strategic with timing was that the problem with top shelf responses is that, it's quarters of the TOC. Nueva has probably heard all of these before. So the question for Nueva then becomes, can they respond to the top shelf responses? Because if they can, the second link doesn't really have a lot of ink on it, and none of it is offensive, right? A card not being specific to the US and being 24 or being 20 some odd years old is not a reason not to believe the card if it's an empirical study. The rebuttal definitely generated offense effectively. It did so with these top shelf turns, all of which are sort of different. Although, again, a central unifying theme is Parsi. So if Nueva gets up and explains why Parsi is wrong, which again, I think that it is, that detracts from a huge amount of Blake's general narrative in the round. And then the rebuttal definitely sort of reiterated the case narrative in that it was really focused on the extent to which the US presence really causes erratic behavior, and it delved into why that is with these turns about how the Trump administration behaves. So for one thing, I think that the only real response other than the not specific to US response that I have real qualms about is this third response on the first link. Saying, oh, well, Nueva forgets that Saudi Arabia is a monarchy. It faces no domestic pressure because there's no elections. For one, this is straight up ignoring the uniqueness that Nueva reads about Saudi Arabia fearing Iran because of the Islamic Revolution, right? Iran was a monarchy, but Mohammad Reza Shah was deposed in an Islamic revolution, and that's why Iran looks the way it looks today. Nueva is saying that Saudi Arabia is terrified of that prospect. They view Iran's ultimate goal as a goal of exporting kind of Islamic revolution to neighboring countries and eventually to Iran or to Saudi Arabia. So you're going to see the Saudi regime deposed. Saying that just because a country doesn't have elections, the government doesn't face internal pressures is kind of silly. Obviously, domestic insurgency and whatever can result in the deposition of the government. That said, I think it was overall a pretty good speech. So let's go and hear what Pranav has to say.
It's going to be starting with all the top level stuff on our case. We'll just frontlining our case, weighing on the top of their case, and then down. Is everyone ready? Cool. On the first piece of weighing, they say state collapse is more important. A, recognize Syria and Yemen are already state collapse, which proves that more proxy wars have a very high probability of leading to proxy conflict. Second of all, they do not give you any specificity on this argument. They never say what states are going to collapse or how they're going to collapse. There's no actual warrant level analysis done on this argument. It validates proxy wars first. It has a much better empirical link of causing state failure. Then there's second, the two warrants. One is a prerequisite to lead to a proliferation of violence. No quantification of how much violence increases or where the violence increases. Then they say it takes more resources to negotiate. Proxy wars take the same amount of resources to negotiate. Then they say Yemen is worse. That doesn't matter. Johnson 18 finds that conflicts like Yemen are actually mostly already intractable. These conflicts are already locked in because the irrelevant from the ground are already locked into fighting. This means the only thing that matters is stopping future conflicts. Present conflicts are intractable. They say the status quo is just bad. That's not a binary. We tell you from our friends, evidence the US is slowly moving down, and that leads to Saudi Arabia always slowly moving forward. It's not just truth or no truth. It's a steady movement of downward truth, which we've empirically seen has led to more aggression. Then on their next piece of weighing, they say nuclear holocaust kills a bunch of people, and it's really bad. Recognize that CNA 18 finds will never be a nuclear holocaust in the Middle East because any actor knows that if they strike, it'll immediately have nuclear fallout themselves because the states are so close to each other. But second, CNA also adds that even if Trump does a low-yield nuclear strike on Iran, at most it would kill 200,000 or 5 million impact still outweighs. They say the Houthis have violated ceasefires and overall looking to regional diplomacy. Two things here. One, we are actually ahead here because the ICG finds that Trump uses leverage to actually stop a full-on Saudi invasion of Yemen, which killed 24 million, which stopped the killing of 24 million people. It's much better than their vague negotiations because it clearly shows a material impact of the conflict. But second, on the Parsi thing specifically, remember, Parsi's negotiation he talks about happened 2 days before the perceived U.S. drawdown. Their timeline's all messed up. The negotiations happened before the U.S. pulled out, not after. Then they say that Trump is emboldened and Trump makes leverage fail. Once again, the empirics disprove. And they say Trump can't control his allies. Clearly, it's not just about how Trump acts, rather about the existence of presence pulls our allies back. It doesn't matter about Trump. Go to our second link. We're dropping all the defense in our first and just going there. They say Parsi proves to negotiate. Remember, A, it was just 2 weeks of negotiations, and B, the strikes resumed in March 30th, which obviously proves that that there was no actual long-term peace, which means that our 2C evidence is also extended because it clearly tells you that Saudi Arabia never wants to negotiate in the long run. They say that our evidence is from the status quo. No, Brent says, and they completely mishandle this, is that every time the U.S. draws down, we empirically see Saudi Arabia surge forward. The historical precedent is really mishandled here. The status quo is not binary, it's nuanced. When the U.S. moves down, Saudi Arabia moves up. That's why we think you should not affirm to lock in more Saudi Arabia moving forward. They say our leads evidence is 20 years old, not specific to the U.S. They don't interact with the warrant. The warrant is that when one country backs another country with a security partnership, obviously applies to the U.S., the probability of conflict decreases by 28%, and they don't give a warrant as to why we can't evaluate it. The entire impact scenario is dropped. We tell you from deep Saudi will fund more Sunni proxy groups. If the U.S. goes away, and that lead to 5 million deaths in 5 new proxy wars across the region, untouched offense there. Let's go to their case. At the top, we're going to say proxy wars outweigh the interstate conflicts and talk about in 2 ways. One is on probability. The CSS 12 finds that 90% of conflicts in the past 15 years have been proxy conflicts, not interstate. But second, even if they win interstate conflict, what God finds is that interstate proxy wars are 28% longer and have 2 times more civilian deaths. So on that, they're a lot worse than interstate wars. On their contention about drones, at the top link level, Trevithick 18 finds the single largest deployment of U.S. Predator drones is in Afghanistan. Our evidence is 7 years older there. Clearly, U.S. military policy has changed. We've got more drones in Afghanistan. But second, Senko 12 finds the majority of our drones are surveillance. On the first impact about civilians, Atlantic 13 finds our drones kill at a 1.5% rate, which is comparatively lower than other counterterrorism mechanisms. But on state killer, once again, proxies are better Lincoln. But second, it should have been triggered already by decades of drone strikes. On their second contention about Yemen, caused by the ICG trend says leverage stopped 24 million people from dying. But second, they tell you that there was an 80% reduction. But no, remember, we tell you this 80% reduction happened in the context of U.S. military presence. We had presence there, so clearly they don't get offense on any of their Yemen advantage. Go to their third connection about the U.S.-Iran war. At the top, we specifically tell you Gobashi 19, the Washington Post finds that U.S. deterrence actually preventing Iran from ever escalating any of its militias to reach any direct confrontation. But second, they say expansion will lead the U.S. to pull away from the table. But Rogan finds no. Iran will never compromise from a place of weakness, and there's sanctions in both worlds, so Iran will never compromise. There's no self-esteem.
Can we see a couple of cards? First, can we see that that Parsi got the timeline wrong, whatever evidence that is? Secondly, can we?
Okay, so let's talk about this rebuttal. It was very efficient. Pranav was very good on his case. He covered all of the responses and basically came back from what was a very effective and very thorough refutation of his case. He was smart with time allocation, like I said, in that he did not focus on the first link of his contention. He just went straight for the second one, which has the better evidence and the longer story anyway. The rebuttal definitely generated offense, although it's sort of unclear how it's going to be implicated. For instance, so there's this Parsi thing, right? And this is going to end up determining the round, most likely, is, is Parsi right or is Parsi wrong? Well, Pranav says that Parsi got the timeline wrong. And if that's true, that would lend support to the neg view that negotiations happened in the presence of troops, which means the AF is wrong. And that definitely further developed the case narrative. So this rebuttal was definitely advancing the narrative of the case. So again, they collapsed on their second link because it was the one with the least ink on it. It was the easiest to collapse to once all the top shelf stuff was handled. The responses I get, so some of the responses to the Trump administration specific top shelf answers are kind of blippy and underwarranted. I don't think Blake is going to blow them up because those responses weren't that great in the first place, but it does give them some leeway to potentially get creative with them. So we'll see whether or not that under frontlining really makes a difference. And then sort of the last thing to consider is, okay, well, what did the weighing do? And the weighing essentially was quite good, I think. The weighing said, at a minimum, state collapse and proxy war are really important to consider. They're very similar, they're very similar, but at a maximum, proxy wars are worse. They're harder to negotiate. All the current proxy wars are intractable, right? Which means that Blake is going to need to prove not pre-existing harm, but that future harm is going to occur, which we know from their case, they are not likely going to be able to do easily. Whereas I think Nueva is in a much better position to do that. On the other hand, Nueva's own weighing, that is not the defense to the Blake weighing, is done very well. Interstate conflicts are way less common now. Proxy conflicts are more common, which means that Nueva's arguments are fundamentally likelier and thus more important. I think this is generally, pretty well done. So let's listen to this crossfire.
Leverage saved 24 million lives. Oh, okay.
What do you want?
To
4 million. Sorry, what was the other?
so it's on the one that was in time, that deterrence. Hasn't come. Pausing for just one card. Only one card has come through for me. When you say links, do you mean like
It's the so the first
Sorry.
links, the negotiations happen as. So I just sent the 2 date cards for Parsi. It happened again in November. It happened again in March.
Yep.
Sorry, what did you say?
We have about 15 seconds remaining.
Okay, sounds good. You ready for cross?
So let's talk about this evidence from 2018 saying Yemen is an intractable conflict. If that is true, why have there been brief periods where there have been ceasefires in the past?
So there's 2 things that are important to recognize here. One, the brief nature of the thing you just said proves that even if they get a small solution, the rebels just continue fighting. That's what happened after the 80% reduction we talked about. It happened again in November. It happened again in March.
Yep, I fully agree. And the reason I agree is because of the mishandled first response, which is that the reason the rebels keep fighting is because Saudis won't give them concessions because of the security guarantee.
No, so the reason why that doesn't make sense is because our Johnson evidence is independent of Saudi action, independent of Iran action. The groups on their own have their own incentives and like viewpoints in the conflict. They're just going to continue fighting. The only risk of solving
that is true of.
Also,
Pranav, that is true of every war in human history. That doesn't mean it is intractable or can never be solved, right?
Wait, so the whole point, we've been trying to solve the Syria and Yemen conflict for 4 or 5 years now, and nothing happens.
That's the status quo.
Is the 5 new conflicts that would also be similarly intractable. If what you're talking about,
I understand your claim, but you've already said that. I'm saying that the logic behind why we just say, it's intractable, and we throw up our hands, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense.
Well, I'm following up my claim with a further warrant, right? The argument is that these conflicts are multifaceted. The best way to move forward is most likely to stop these multifaceted conflicts from spreading throughout the region where they can wreak even more havoc. Now, can I have a question?
Yeah, every conflict is multifaceted. Go ahead.
Okay. Let's talk about your B warrant, your C3. So in order, is U.S. military presence the only way the U.S. pressures Iran?
It's the only way that triggers direct conflict because there's actual military escalation between the 2 in Iraq happening now as of April. That's the conceded Abood evidence.
Why would the economic, you can just say that, but my question is, why would the economic harms of sanctions push Iran to get more aggressive to defend themselves?
So it doesn't matter because even if Iran gets more aggressive, we don't have true presence in the region for them to attack and pull us into a war. So it doesn't link into the impacts.
Other stuff around the region. We have permanent base.
So just for the record, I think this line of questioning is a little unstrategic. Pranav makes this analysis in his rebuttal that it's the economic war that the US is waging on Iran that is also potentially a cause for conflict. And so he's letting Jack respond to it, essentially a speech earlier than Blake would otherwise be able to respond to it. And he's essentially giving, it's crossfire, right? And he's crossfiring around with tech judges who aren't paying attention. So he's letting Blake try out different front lines, and they're going to figure out, based on how this crossfire goes, which one is the best.
In Afghanistan, we have boats in international waters.
Yeah, not in the parts near Iran. Also, again, you spend 5 seconds answering this link by saying, quote, "We can deter Iran." No warrant, no empirics, no explanation. That is not sufficient to answer the argument.
I said the U.S. presence deters Iran from scaling its militias to attack because they're scared of the U.S.
Right, that is a claim. That is a claim.
So why does
it deter them? We need a warrant, but I didn't. There was no warrant.
The warrant is that they don't want to escalate to confrontation with the U.S. Simple.
Well, then that should have been in rebuttal because.
Okay, so why did Soleimani not escalate to nuclear war?
Again, post Soleimani, they're escalating literally right now. Again, Abood from last week says they have re-escalated.
So why did Soleimani?
That's time. We're past time.
So that crossfire sort of flitted around a lot of the main narrative question of the round and sort of stuck to issues that are, yes, related, but sort of on the periphery and have more to do with weighing. I think this was probably strategic on both sides because it means, again, crossfire can sort of be a testing ground for what arguments are going to pan out well on speeches and which ones aren't. So in sort of keeping this conversation outside of crossfire, they're playing their cards closer to their chest. So let's see what the summary is going to look like.
Not taking forever.
Morgan, do you need prep?
No.
Wait, actually, we got to take let's take a couple seconds of prep just so you can check this text. We'll start running prep now. 7 more seconds used.
Are you all still taking prep?
No.
Oh, sorry. I meant to be talking to you guys. I didn't notice. I didn't know I was muted. There's like a lot of weighing stuff at the top, which is why the order is gonna be kind of weird. It's gonna start on my case, and it's basically gonna be like top down, pretty much, right? Like in terms of like front lines, and then when I get to your case, the best way to think of it is just like straight all the way down, like line by line, pretty much. Because like a lot of the weighing debate is happening on like 2 different places, if that makes sense. So
That's your case, my case.
but yeah, it's basically my case, your case, and then I'll signpost so you guys know what's going on. Okay. Is everyone ready? They get to our contention theory with 15 seconds left in rebuttal. It is not enough to take this out. The only response that they have is that the U.S. is there always deterring Iran from attacking. 1 hour evidence is from 2020. It postdates them. And the reason that's important is since that evidence was written, tensions between the U.S. and Iran have escalated to the point where Iran sees it as an existential threat. Next, their evidence says that the way that Iran will escalate instead is through proxy conflicts. Our impact scenario says that it starts with the proxy conflict in Iraq. The Abedou evidence is really clear. Let's extend the link. The link says that the United States' presence in Iraq is an existential threat to Iran, and they're going to do everything they can to expel the forces out of Iraq unless we withdraw right away. The evidence is really good. It presents literally a binary between U.S. withdrawal or war with Iran that starts in Iraq. The reason it starts as a proxy conflict is because Iran begins to start the war by funding proxy militias in Iraq, and then that escalates to U.S. war. The Tusanovsky evidence is really good. It says that the United States will strike Iran's nuclear reactors, which releases a lot of nuclear energy, causes nuclear fallout, killing millions of people. Again, this is not nuclear war. This is striking the nuclear facilities. It's just like Chernobyl. Let's look at their weighing. So first of all, they say that 90% of conflicts are proxy conflicts. Well, this conflict is the other 10%. Also, they don't link into all proxy conflicts. Next, they say that proxy conflicts kill 2 times more civilian deaths. That's answered by the war evidence that Jack reads in a bottle. It says that a potential U.S.-Iran war will be the deadliest war that the region has literally ever seen, which it makes sense because it's between like the U.S. and Iran. They're 2 huge powers. Next, on Yemen, on the ICG turn, about like 24 million people. First of all, that like ceasefire like ended very quickly, and since then, all other ceasefires have failed. Clearly, it's not preventing enough. Also, like, and also like it's like the blockade is still going on. So at that point, let's do some weighing. Let's extend the weighing. This is the weighing that Jack did on their case in rebuttal, by the way. First of all, answering their Johnson evidence that says that the proxy conflicts are literally always locked in, so you have to prevent future conflicts. 1, there's no warrant for why this is true, and 2, that's clearly not true so far as ceasefires are happening. Next, let's extend the weighing on our case. Why our case outweighs. 1, on magnitude, a direct conflict is much bigger than any sort of proxy conflict because A, the 2 countries fighting have much larger military capabilities, and B, it draws in allies. They respond by saying that there's no like mutually assured destruction means no nuclear attack. We're not doing a nuclear scenario. Next, they totally dropped the prerequisite weighing that says that a direct conflict in the U.S. Iran expands to proxy conflicts even outside the Middle East because Iran is trying to counter U.S. influence literally everywhere in the world. That means we link into stopping future conflicts, even if you believe that all other conflicts are locked in. That is clean drop. It is a clean place to vote for us. Next, let's extend some resources on their case. First is the Parsi evidence. The Parsi proves that our side is empirically true. That the Parsi evidence says that when the U.S. threatened to withdraw its troops, that means Saudi Arabia turned to diplomacy in Yemen and airstrikes decreased by 80%. They see that the timeline is off. Literally, even if the stop and violence happened before the withdrawal, they did it because the U.S. threatened to withdraw. They knew that the U.S. was already going to do it. That's why that happened. Next, extend the totally drop turn in the first contention that says that the everyone in the Saudi royal family is anti-U.S. and anti-imperialism, meaning if the U.S. withdraws, it's seen as a victory for the royal family, meaning they no longer need to pursue aggression in Yemen because they have a political victory. They don't need to be as aggressive. That's an independent warrant as to why they scale back and we solve the price of conflict.
Okay, so let's talk about that. So I think that Morgan, for one thing, does a really good job consolidating the round. Although he says, you know, in his outline of what a summary is going to look like, that it's going to be all over the place and up and down both cases. It really ends up just being about weighing the AFC3 and then the, you know, negative sole contention. I think that for one thing, at least the persuasion factor, there's no real ballot directive language going on. Morgan isn't saying where you're going to vote and why in those terms. He's sort of using too much flow jargon. And even for a flow judge, this can be kind of annoying because it's not the same thing as sort of the bright, shining, you know, look at me, vote for me here, that ballot directive language is. So he could have benefited from that. You know, I think that there aren't really any major strategic mistakes or issues with efficiency or effectiveness, except for extending defense on the first link, right? It's very obvious that Nueva is not going for the first link. They said they're not going to, so dropping the second link isn't great. That said, Morgan does a pretty good job answering everything else. He really clears up why his third contention is unique, why it isn't responded to by the negative responses. The Yemen stuff felt a little blippy, but overall it was okay. So the comparative, I think, was done really well in the weighing. And that has to do with the comparative between, you know, these proxy conflicts where you essentially have Nueva saying, oh, well, the current conflicts are intractable. There's no warrant for that, Morgan points out. He explains why his impact world is bigger than their impact world. And so while that isn't as great as a link comparison, that is pretty good. And then, of course, the link comparison just comes in over the Parsi debate. Who's right, Parsi or Brands, right? That's where the link comparison comes in. So I think that more could have been done on that, although I think, right, so now the problem you have is you have both teams reading different interpretations of Parsi. Blake is saying that, you know, the Saudis knew there was going to be a drawdown, so they engaged in diplomacy. That's why it happened 2 days before. Nueva is saying that the card can't claim causality because there was no decrease in troops. Now the judges are going to need some reason to differentiate between these two forms of analysis, and Morgan didn't really get at that. I think if there was one major problem with this speech, is that there wasn't a whole lot of persuasion going on aside from flow language. It was very flow, sort of almost like another second rebuttal. There needs to be more persuasion and more ballot directive language. That said, it was a well done speech. So let's hear the second summary.
Me at the seventh and the Camus.
So I'm a beachside hooker.
Let's only wing the our case. So I'm just gonna condense all the weighing onto like the top of our case. And then I'm gonna go my case circuit. Simple. Let's only wing the intractability claim from Johnson first. They said there's no warrant for Johnson. The warrant for Johnson is in rebuttal and is well explained across. The argument is very simple. Proxy groups have their own individual motives for why they're in the conflict in the first place, which means top level diplomacy never worked. This is really important weighing because it means the absolvency mechanisms will never be implicated through reducing proxy conflicts because top level negotiations between like the US and Iran never function de-escalate conflict. Proxies are the only thing that matters. But second, on the probability claims, their response to the GOB evidence, which is put on their case, we should move here now, is that they create the deadliest war, but GOB is comparative, which is important because it tells you that proxy wars cause 2 times more civilian deaths than interstate wars. This is really key because even if they say their war is the deadliest war ever, that means that our wars are comparatively 2 times worse. The negative is always a comparatively better balance. But second, they can see the CNA evidence tells you even if Trump does the strike and only kill 200,000 people, we can outweigh on severity insofar as Fisher talked about 5 million people. Now let's go to my uniqueness scenario. There are a lot of problems here. They completely conceded the Marcus 19 evidence that tells you after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, Saudi Arabia views Iran as an existential threat. This means you have to vote next. The entire lens of the round is to how Saudi Arabia will react to Iran and how it increases aggression in the affirmative world. They have also dropped the Goldenberg evidence that tells you all these proxy wars in the status quo were started due to insecurity as a result of Saudi Iranian competition when the US pulled away and did small drawdowns. That means the uniqueness only flows negative. They make 2 responses. The first response is that so go back to the weighing, they make a short circuit response about a nuclear conflict going to the Middle East. We tell you specifically, they said that Iran is a regional actor. We agree that Iran only cares about the region. Iran will not beyond the region, but second, the short circuit is never implicated for terminal impact. Okay, so back to uniqueness. Now, under uniqueness, to their turnabout policy, there are 2 responses. They completely dropped the ICG evidence that tells the US through Trump has empirically used leverage to stop a full-on invasion which saved 24 million people. This is conceded offensively negative because it means we always outweigh all the Yemen negotiations and we outweigh their entire case. They never impact this big of a terminal impact, 100% probability because it already happened. They read this policy as a small decrease by 80%. 1, it's short term, but 2, they have conceded the index that tells you the reduction happened before negotiations happened, which will only do the US presence. Now, go to my second link. They try to turn on the first link. It doesn't matter. We're going for it. We can win the second link. There's no contextualization of how they can implicate the first link. On the second link, they have to see the Hunziker evidence that tells you US presence uniquely signals skin in the game and branch continues. Any US retreat would create a chaotic environment. They have dropped the leads evidence which does the comparative and tells you security partners decrease the probability of conflict by 28%. Again, the MAG is ahead on the comparative analysis. They have dropped deep in level, which tells you Saudi Arabia would fund new proxy groups and 5 new escalation hotspots, which Fisher said would kill 5 million people. But what it goes a step further and saying an existing conflict, that new funding would increase violence by 40%, increase civilian death by 40%. We're ahead on the flow. Go to their case. Only 3 contentious about US Iran. They really mishandled Gobashi. Their entire scenario is dependent on malicious escalating, but Gobashi specifically isolates deterrence as the reason why preventing proxy escalation. They don't get access to any other escalation impacts terminal defense. That was 3 or 5, right?
Okay, so let's talk about that. So I think Noah does an even better job of consolidating the round than Morgan did. He puts all of the weighing in one place for one thing, which is hugely helpful. while he's not doing weighing between the weighing mechanisms at play, which would be more helpful, he's putting it all in one place and he's advancing sort of a consistent weighing narrative. Again, not a huge amount of ballot directive language, but there is some things like we're ahead on the flow. And the neg is ahead on comparative analysis. That stuff is helpful. It for one subliminally influences judges and also just helps recap basically the implication of all of the flow talk that has happened. I don't think Noah made any huge mistakes on the flow. I think that this was overall well executed. Some of it could have been more efficient, but generally there were no major mistakes on the flow. Okay, so I think that this ICG turn is the most effective turn that Noah has gone for, right? Because whether or not Parsi is true, ICG outweighs it enormously, right? 24 million dead in a land invasion is bigger than a 2-week 80% reduction in airstrikes. So at a minimum, neg is winning that, right? The other broader debate between proxies and interstate Iran-US war is way, way more muddled. It's very easy for the judge to just affirm on ICG, which is why it's smart that he spent so much time on it, which makes me think that the speech was efficient. Also, the defense that he goes for on the AF case about deterrence preventing escalation, yes, he could have spent more time on it. Yes, it would have been better to warrant it more, but I think it's enough to have something there for Pranav to bring up in final focus. Again, I think the weighing was done pretty well. What would have really helped, and what I think Noah did miss out on was helping the judges out with differentiating, because there's all of this intractability stuff going on. There's the GOB comparative, right? There's all of this, and it's just hard to look at all of that and make some sense of it. Yes, when you spend 5 minutes looking at it and piecing it through, it can make sense, but it's helpful, in a 10-second snippet to explain what all of that means. The comparative was done really well between proxies and between the proxies and interstate and neg and AF. And I think that the persuasive language there could have been more of, but it was relatively good. So let's listen to Grand Cross.
Extension over time. Matter insofar as I
was just muted on the lock. Jack. Oh wait, sorry, nothing. I was just muted on the lock. I didn't hear what you said.
Okay. Doesn't matter. Can I have the first question?
Sure.
So why does your weighing about proxy conflicts matter insofar as Morgan tells you that the Iran-US scenario begins with proxy escalation and it spills over into other regions?
All that matters. Wait, so you're saying that your link is proxies, but this is purely impact.
No. We link in through proxies.
I agree. Your link is proxies.
And it's also an impact.
But your impact scenario is a US-Iran confrontation. And so we're saying that the proxy war impact on our case, the impact level outweighs the impact level of the US-Iran conflict.
Wait. But if we have an internal link that turns your argument.
Right, so you're making a short circuit argument. I agree, I made it confusing.
And the extra added impact of US-Iran.
Right, I think it was a problem structurally with my speech. I messed up. I read the weighing and then I forgot to go short circuit. So I went weighing, uniqueness, and then I went back to the short circuit. I made that very clear. I gave you like 5 seconds of pen time at least. I can repeat the response if you missed it.
Into the short circuit.
No, I mean, if we all missed it, we all missed it. I mean, you can have a question.
Well, I'm sure the judges didn't miss it because that was very clear.
It's on the floor.
I said go back and answer Morgan's short circuit.
Yeah.
In order for you to win your link, you have to win that Iraq will lash out, right? First.
That will lashes out?
No. We just have to win. What's happening in the status quo is literally causing a war. You drop a boot from April who says that there's current, direct military conflict, happening in Iraq between these militias.
Right. So really quickly, I think Noah owning up, sort of, and realizing that his weighing, wasn't done in the most clear way is important. That's sort of, what I said is it's helpful to differentiate, and it needs to all be in one place. And he made a good effort of doing that, but the short circuit was kind of confusing.
It's basically sucking us into an inevitable.
That's fine.
Fantastic.
Is incredibly good. I urge everyone in the round to call for it. It says
Okay, they
that
just
there-
send on the email chain if it's
it
so
says that
good.
there is specific. Okay, I will after this. Yeah,
Yeah.
It
Thank
says
you.
that
When does
there is
that
a direct binary, right? It's
When does
either
that
the U.S. pulls out of Iraq now, or there is a full-fledged confrontation between the U.S. and Iran.
The thing is, you're dodging the question, right? We can agree. There's
If it's happening in status quo, when does escalation happen between US and Iran via proxies?
First of all, we'd say it's pretty soon. Second of all, we'd say it doesn't really matter specifically when. Third, we'd say it's not really possible to nail down that timeline and you know it. And fourth, that's a brand new response in second classified or in
That's
grand
not a
classified.
response. It's a vague question.
Grand
Ask the question.
question about the timeline and everything, but yeah, you can have it.
Okay, so so far as we all agree on the evidence that says that it is a political victory for the Saudi royal family if the U.S. pulls out, right? And your link says that political victories for the Saudi royal family mean that they don't have to be aggressive in Yemen because they have the political victories from somewhere else. Why does that not turn the link into proxy conflicts? Because if they have their political victory from U.S. withdrawal, right, they don't need to get their political victory.
This is not in summary, though. It's my claim. And what I
Yes,
say in
it
summary.
is.
So this is sort of Morgan trying to salvage his response, his responding to the first link instead of the second. It's an interesting idea. I don't think it's really fleshed out enough in summary for me to be inclined to vote for it myself in final focus.
Is that
No,
you do not make the
no.
extension.
No,
Any
no,
link extension.
okay,
Just
okay.
say we turn the link. There's
You
no
have
implication
two
of how much you turn the link. But second, and way more important,
Much less.
both links operate independently. We've done much more weighing on the second link about epsilon uncertainty.
You have two links into one impact. If we
Also,
turn
I
one of
think
the
that's-
links, we get access to the impact. You can't just say that you're going for the second link and ignore it.
No, that's why
okay.
I frontline it.
Do people
think
want
we're-
the evidence?
guys,
Do people want the
oh.
Abud evidence? Yeah. Do people want the Abud evidence?
Yeah, just go ahead and send it. There's no harm in sending
All
it.
right, I'll send it.
First, it is over time. Don't evaluate it. All right. When all that is finished, I'm ready to do my final focus if everyone's ready. Take that as a yes. It's going to go our case, weighing debate. I think similar order as Noah did, then their case. Is everyone ready? They extend one response in summary, two things. First, it is over time, don't evaluate it. Secondly, he extends through ink through Morgan's frontline. The Abud evidence is from April. It postdates. It indicates that Iran is escalating right now in Iraq. The evidence is literally fantastic. They're attacking forces right now, which is sucking us into an inevitable conflict. That's where our link comes in. We say that if we don't pull out and get out of Iraq, we're sucked into this inevitable conflict, where in the Chuskovsky evidence explains that America's war plan against Iraq is to strike nuclear reactors, which then causes a nuclear plume across half the Middle East, which wipes out the massive amounts of the population and kills millions and millions of people. On to the weighing debate. We outweigh in a few ways. First is strength of link. This link got conceded in summary. Their case flow is very messy. It's the cleanest place to vote. The next thing they say is that we don't give a warrant is on the conflicts being intractable for the terms on their case. Again, they don't give they just the reason the warrant for why the conflicts are intractable is because they have motives. That's not a real warrant. Everyone has motives. But then they try to outweigh and say there will be more civilian casualties. But their gains evidence is not comparative to a US-Iran scenario, just any interstate conflict. They still drop our warrant evidence explaining US-Iran would be the worst interstate conflict in modern history. Then they say that a Trump strike would only kill 200,000. Again, ignoring Morgan's frontline. He ignores the Chuskovsky evidence explaining that the US plan is to target Iran's nuclear reactors, which kills millions of people, half the Middle East. Then the last thing then is the proxy conflicts. The warrant evidence explains that if US-Iran escalation happens, proxy conflicts proliferate across the Middle East and across Africa. That outweighs their stuff on scope because you get more proxy conflicts, all the ones they talk about, plus ones in entirely different regions. But then they have two new responses, frame these through the idea that this argument was cold, dropped in rebuttal. Don't evaluate these new responses. I read this way in rebuttal. The first response is that it wasn't implicated. Yes, it was. The evidence says you kill hundreds of thousands. The second thing they say is that Iran doesn't want to fund. Iran funds militias across the entire world. They're the #1 state sponsor of terrorism. On their case, the one thing we need to extend is the Parsi evidence. The empiric is when we threatened to withdraw, they did diplomacy. This proves you can respond to existential threats through diplomacy. The second section is that they concede a turn, which is that if you reduce U.S. presence, anti-U.S. sentiment goes away, and the need for Saudis to lash out is away. That means that's an independent reason why you get less proxy wars in our world from Saudi Arabia than you do in theirs. This was a dropped turn on one of their links. Very bad for them. So vote for.
I have 12 seconds, right?
Okay. So before Pranav talks, let's go through that. So I think Jack does a pretty good job in this speech. So let's start by thinking about what issues the speech needed to resolve, for Jack and Blake to be in a winning position. So the largest liability ahead of time was sort of this weighing mess, particularly the argument that, diplomacy isn't going to work, so it doesn't matter, and that comparatively proxies will kill 2 times as many people. So even if, the AF wins their impact, the neg impact is dramatically larger. I think Jack handles this well. He condenses the weighing better than Noah did. Noah started it, but he was in a harder position. I think Jack does it very well. Strength of link is always a clean, way to weigh things. It's very understandable. The conflict analysis, it's late, to say really for the first time in such a fleshed out way, yes, this is generally true, but for the worst conflict in modern history, it may not be true. I think that response is sort of fleshed out in a new way, and it's a little late to do that, but generally, it makes sense. And I think it's done relatively well. So then I think also this analysis about US-Iran escalations happening, causing proxies, so magnifying the impact is also good. So I think ahead of this speech, it was pretty close, but I think Nueva may have been a little ahead. And I think that's because of the ICG term. And I don't know that Jack really handled that very well. He extended Parsi through ink. He didn't handle the ICG turn. He blows up this thing about reducing Saudi pressure to lash out, but it's sort of unclear, for one, I don't think that was implicated enough beforehand, but it's sort of unclear, what the terminal impact of this is. So I think that this speech was a good one, but it would have been a better summary than a final focus, because I don't think it does all it needs to do necessarily to win Blake the round. That said, the speech definitely clarified the round ending voting issue. I understood Blake's argument way better after final focus than after any other speech in the round. I think it's very clean. Again, the ballot directing rhetoric, there could be more of it, but there was plenty more than summary, and it was done well, that helps the judges understand what they're supposed to do. And it's sort of commonly thought, oh, you don't need to tell flow judges what they're supposed to do. Yeah, you don't need to, but it helps you to, right? Because flow judges are still fallible. And then so having that extra ballot directive language, for one, really helps us out by knowing what to look at. And secondly, also really does give them an inkling of an idea what you expect them to do, and will generally help them tailor their decision to make the most sense, even if it's one you dislike. Yeah, so I think that time was allocated generally well, where the most of it was spent on rebuilding Blake's argument and doing the weighing. Because this debate is going to come down to weighing. Neither team has excellent defense on the other team's case. It all comes down to weighing. So I think the time was allocated well for that reason, and I think he cleared up the weighing largely in Blake's favor. So let's see what happens with Pranav's speech.
Oh, yeah, sorry, 13. So we're gonna start.
Yeah.
All right, so the order is going to be starting on the weighing, then going to our case, then their case. Is everyone ready? All right, so This round comes down to who you think is winning the weighing debate. We are so far ahead on the warrant level. They just say this is, quote, the worst interstate conflict. They do not interact with our GOB evidence. It says when you're comparing interstate to proxies, proxies are always A, 28% longer, and B, kill 2 times as many civilians. Even if they get a really bad interstate war, they've dropped clean warrants as to why proxies are always worse. But second, their terminal impact is severely mitigated. Our CNA evidence says the most likely Trump strike would kill 200,000 people, not the half civilian population they're talking about. They have dropped this evidence, which means we're already outweighing on scope. If we win our 5 million impacts in our case, they've dropped clean mitigation on their impact, which means we're winning the round on scope. We're A, ahead on severity, and B, ahead on scope. We're winning the weighing debate. Let's go to our case. Really easy, just place to sign your ballot is the untouched ICT turn that says U.S. leverage stopped an annexation of Saudi Arabia that would have killed 24 million people. 100% strength of linkage is conceded, and the impact outweighs our case. There's no terminalized extension in their case. But then they say that they can make Yemen worse. No, they've been around Johnson evidence really well. Johnson says the high-level negotiations will never trickle down to the small groups, which is why, quote, conflicts right now are intractable. The only thing you can solve is future conflicts. These 5 million people who are going to die in these new conflicts that Saudi Arabia would start. They read this link term that basically says Saudi Arabia gets support from withdrawal. There's not nearly enough work done in this turn for you to even consider voting on it. They never say how much support they get, what the support transitions to in terms of proxy wars, or where they start this proxy wars. The turn is not well done at all. Don't vote on it. Go to our link, 100% conceded. Hunziker says U.S. presence signals skin in the game, and Brand says every time the U.S. draws down, Saudi Arabia moves forward. So Leeds finds having a security partner decreases conflict by 28%. Deep says Saudi Arabia funds proxy groups in 5 new conflict areas, killing 5 million people, the biggest impact. But on their case, remember, first of all, they dropped the CNA evidence that severely mitigates their impact. But second, the Gobashi evidence says the Iraq groups will never escalate past the brink. They never explain what has changed in the status quo about tensions. There's no warrant as to why their post-state matters. At the end of the round, they haven't won the fact that Iraq is not going to escalate no matter what. So there's never going to be a conflict and severe mitigation of impact. Please vote.
Okay. So, okay. So I think Pranav's speech was excellent. For one thing, the only thing I really wish he could have had more time for is this thing he does at the end where he says, here's what you know, now this is the information you're going to use to make your decision. But so, you know, before this, Jack had caught, you know, had really caught up, I think, to Nueva in a lot of ways. But I think Pranav ends up taking the win, in my view, although the decision ends up being a 2-1 for Blake. And there are a few reasons why. You know, for starters, I think, yes, Blake is winning their case, but the mitigation is never answered. And I haven't really mentioned that before, but I think it's important to mention now. 200,000 is just a smaller impact than Nueva's case. So if I believe Nueva is winning their case, you know, at a minimum, just comparing the 2 cases, Nueva is going to win. And then we can look at the weighing in a second. But I think that Jack does sort of lazy frontlining where he says, okay, the response was over time and it's through ink. You need to do more than that, right? I agree that saying Abood post-states is not really a response. If escalation is happening now, it doesn't matter because they never answer the super analysis, let's call it, that says that escalation will never meet the brink required for war. On the other hand, their link has dropped. I agree that Jack's response about anti-US pressure comes too little, too late. It's not going to win Blake the round, and so the Nueva case proper is dropped. So it's all about the weighing. So let's talk about the weighing. I think that okay. So they say their GOB evidence says that proxies are always longer and worse. This isn't really warranted, but it is sort of dropped. Even if it's the worst interstate conflict, they don't explain why the worst interstate conflict is not as bad as proxy conflicts, which are always 2 times worse. So I think that, you know, Nueva is probably winning a risk of a worse conflict. I also think that the Iran conflict is only going to kill 200,000 people versus several million. So I think they're winning on scope. Now, the one thing that's important is that if Blake wins that US-Iran escalation happens, then they can win that proxy wars happen all over the place. The issue is, like I said before, I don't think they're winning that. I think that requires sort of too much intervention, too much looking at, cards, which I don't think I need to do because I don't think there's adequate work done on this bright line question that Nueva points out. I also think blowing up this ICG turn is good. 24 million lives saved with 100% strength of link because it's dropped is really good. Yeah, I thought that was done well. I think the speech was really effective. It clarified round-ending voting issues in a really accessible way to show the judges sort of what they're supposed to do. It wasn't super fast, which was also really useful. There was lots of ballot directing rhetoric, which also helps the judges know what they're supposed to do. And then there was comparative analysis done between weighing mechanisms, which is saying that no matter what you decide on all the other weighing stuff, their argument is so mitigated that we're winning on scope. I think this final focus really distilled the round a lot more than Noah's summary. It condensed the weighing, made it cleaner. It went for fewer arguments and did them sort of in a more concise and articulate way that I thought was very useful. I thought the time was allocated well on weighing, which is the ultimate deciding factor, a little bit on their case, but not so much that it was kind of gratuitous, and not so much that they were forced to make claims they hadn't made before. Also briefly on this turn, which is really good, and on their case. Okay, overall, I think that the best thing would be for practicing redos would be redoing Jack and particularly Morgan's speeches, or Morgan and particularly Jack's speeches, apologies, but also Noah, right? Noah's speech is sort of emblematic. You're ahead. How do you stay ahead as best you can? And the answer is being more efficient and more clear. Noah did a good job, but it's possible to do better. So those are the three speeches I would really recommend redoing. The final focus in both, the Blake final focus in both summaries. I think that overall, what this round demonstrates is that the comparative needs to happen earlier because it all comes pretty late, and it makes me as the judge, sort of be during Grand Cross scratching my head saying, oh, well, Blake could win on this, Nueva could win on this. I prefer sitting there saying, unless one team screws up massively, they are going to win. And I think Nueva was in a position where that could have happened, but unfortunately, because of the way the round ended up, and because there wasn't great job, wasn't really fantastic, fleshing out of the weighing until really late in the round, that didn't end up happening. So yeah, I think this was a good round. I would have ended up voting for Nueva. I think they do a better job in the end, but it's a really good round, and it definitely teaches people and can be a very useful resource for looking at high-level flow tech debates and really thinking about how to do weighing well and how to meta weigh. This debate would have benefited a lot from better comparison between weighing mechanisms. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. And again, I recommend that you practice with redos of Morgan and Noah's speeches and also Jack's final focus. Thank you.